Luca was not a very tall man, but rather short in comparison to his brother Dragic, who was said to be 6'5", and Juro, who was over 6 feet in height. Luca's citizen papers has his height as 5'6". His hair. Luca's brother Luban was not a very tall man either. He probably was just a little bit taller than Luca, perhaps 5'8". Luca was rather very thin, and he had dark, wavy hair, and his complexion was fair. Although he was about to reach 21, he had no facial hair to give him an older look. Had Luca been sent back home in Bremen, he would have had to go into the army, as most men, when they reached 21, they had to go into the Austro-Hungary army at that time. Luca said he left Bremen about the 22nd of April. His ticket put him in steerage, as most peasants going to America could not afford anything else. While at sea, Luca never said he was seasick, but he told of others being ill. One day Luca left the steerage area, and he wanted to explore the upper deck of the ship. One of the officers, seeing him on top, told him, "You have too many women interested in you, and their men don't like that. You have to go below before you get yourself in trouble." This man was no doubt being polite to a peasant, but ironically, Luca thought the women actually were after him. Other than this incident, Luca talked little about being aboard the ship for 13 days. The ship that carried Luca to America was the ship brought him to Ellis Island, New York. Luca said he and the passengers were taken to the Great Hall. It was a rather frightening experience for all the hopeful immigrants. Luca waited for his turn to be examined by those in authority. He said he saw several people being rejected and women in tears. He thought, "I came so far from my birthplace, and if I have to go back, what will it cost me? How will I survive?" When it came to his turn, he was asked his name and where he was from, and his destination. His destination was to a relative named Malich in Wilmerding, PA. His slip from the passage ship showed that he had $8 when he arrived. He was given a quick physical exam, and the doctor, when he said he was okay, slapped Luca's back, and he said he flew practically across the great hallway. He told his children he had never seen bathrooms, toilets, until his trip to America. When asked what was his reaction when he saw the bathroom facilities, he began to laugh and said, "I thought the toilets were cooking pots," and he couldn't believe people were using them to relieve themselves. Officials at Ellis gave him a lunch bag, which had a sandwich and a banana. Luca got another shock while in America. For the first time in his life, he saw a black man, and he thought it must be the devil himself. The train ride was seemingly long. The conductor left Luca off at Pitcairn. Perhaps some of the railroad workers would help him get to Wilmerding. Luca had no idea where Wilmerding was located. He said he talked to one man, and the man told him he couldn't take him to Wilmerding until he finished his workday. Luca sat and waited, not knowing Wilmerding was only a short distance walking. Luca never mentioned the man's name who was his guide, but he took him to Wilmerding, and the address Luca gave him. It was May 6th, and the home he came to was Theodor Uzelats, and they were celebrating Sveti Juraj. Luca walked into the house, and someone recognized him and said, Hey, evo našeg pjevača. Hey, here's our singer. The Uzelac home was a welcome center for many who came to the area. Luka hadn't eaten for many hours, and while they asked him to sing, he told them he hadn't eaten and would be more than happy to join them in song singing once he ate. The hosts were gracious and served him, and of course singing no doubt reverberated to the rooftops thereafter. Luka always considered May 6th to be a special day in his life, and he called May 6th his birthday in America and Sveti Juraj his second Krishna Slava. It would certainly seem he was correct in saying May 6th was indeed a kind of new birthday for him. To leave one's homeland to travel many miles and cross an ocean is no doubt an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do. Yet compelling circumstances forced Luka and people like himself to leave loved ones, not only to better their own lives, but they hoped to be able to improve the living of those whom they left behind, especially parents. Unfortunately, Luka's parents were all gone, but he had his brothers over there. Luka had no money and he needed to find work quickly. Someone told him there was work up in Yukon in a mine, so he decided to go there. He did get a job and was careful with the wages given him. The exact days he worked is not known to his family. He didn't stay long there, however, because he became a bit frightened and concerned for his safety and well-being when he heard there was some men preying on the immigrants and robbing them. Ironically, Luka knew them to be of his ethnic origin. Luka had on his person a money belt. His family still has it in their possession. One day, two men saw Luka and said to him in his native tongue, "Hey Luka, we'll be checking your waist." With those words firm in his mind, he had no wish to stay, and he thought to himself, "I worked hard for these meager wages, and I'm not about to let anybody take it away." And he took his belongings and came back to the Walwomerdine area. The first St. Nicholas Serbian Orthodox Church was about to be consecrated in 1905, and a dear friend of Luka's named George Drakulic, in later years at one of the church meetings discussing plans for the consecration for the building of another church, made mention of the fact that when the first church in Womerdine was built, that Luka Drakulic pledged 1/2 of the pay he had received for the new Serbian Orthodox Church. He made this point to stress how important the old pioneers were to the community. Upon hearing Juja mention this fact, Luka's daughter, who happened to be at the meeting, felt so touched upon hearing Juja say this about Luka. Helen wondered if Luka was yet working at Yukon at the time of the church consecration, as he didn't start to work on the railroad until 1905. Somewhere shortly after he came to the area, Luka came upon the man who married his beloved Sophie. The man asked Luka how things were back at the Maliches. Luka said he was regretful all his life for the answer he gave him, because Mr. Malich was a good person, but probably Luka loved his daughter Sophie, and Malich wouldn't let her marry Luka, and no doubt this fact still grieved Luka. So when Sophie's husband asked Luka if Malich replaced Luka, Luka told him yes, they hired a nice young man from the Selo. Of course, Malich told him to tell his son-in-law they hired a girl from the village. As it turned out, the son-in-law left America and went back home, and thus ended the extra income to the Malich household. One day, Malich came to America for some purpose, and he looked for Luka. When he found Luka, he was quite bitter as he began to speak to him. He demanded that Luka pay what he owed. Luca said he couldn't pay the full amount of his debt, but managed to give him most of it. The exact amount of his debt is not known to his family, as Luca often would refer to money not in terms of dollars, but what was referred to as forenti back in the homeland. Luca, I believe, looked back at that moment with sorrow and regret for his behavior. But as Luca himself said, the devil always looks for a moment of weakness in us and then goes to work. The railroad yards in Pitcairn were hiring men, and Luca began to make inquiries as to how to go about getting work. One man of Slovak descent told Luca, "You have to go and see Andy Morris. He's the one who can get you a job." Apparently Andy Morris had been getting some payoffs from the immigrants for being hired, and Luca was not about to give away his money if he didn't have to. So when he inquired about working on the railroad, he asked one Slovak man how could he talk when he had no knowledge of the English language. The man told him, "When the interviewer says anything to you, just reply yes." Well, Luca listened to what the man told him and kept saying yes. At the end of the interview, he told Luca, "You have no sense, John." And of course Luca said yes, but he hired Luca anyway. However, Luca told of one individual who was looking for work, and a prankster who thought it would be rather funny told the immigrant when he went into the hiring office to say, "Mr. Boss, you son o' bitch, give me job." Hearing him, the man got an interpreter and asked him to point out the man who told him to come inside. The man was brought inside and immediately was told, "You are fired." After Luca was hired, some of those men who paid Andy Morris asked Luca if he went to see Andy, and Luca told them no, he went on his own. They were shocked, and Andy, no doubt, was knocked down a notch in importance. Luca's life in the homeland gave him strength and perseverance, and as his family looked back at his past and hardships he endured, it seemed to them that the good Lord cared for their father. For had he stayed in his homeland, he would have been drafted to fight in World War I, known as the Great War, where history records record Serbia lost 1/3 of its adult male population. Also, World War II came, and the atrocities that were done to the Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies will never be forgotten by their survivors. And Luca fortunately escaped that tragic time. A Croatian couple whose last name was Ferenc had a house on Grand Street in Wall. They took in boarders, and Luca boarded with them. Luca said the beds in the house were never cold, as there were 3 shifts. The men that worked each shift had bed space. He told his family that a house now occupied by Eleanor Blazevich, wife of the late Joseph Bob Blazevich, son of the late Pana and Yuba Blazevich, once boarded 20 men. The town of Wall boarded the railroad yards, and the Pitcairn railroad yards once upon a time employed 15,000 employees. Luca saved his money and was not as some of the men who wasted their hard-earned money playing cards and boozing. He saved to bring his brother Juro to America. Juro came in 1907, and he too was went to live with the Ferences. Juro got a job on the railroad also. Living in boarding house had its stories. Luca said with so many men coming and going, the board keeper had to be organized and have some kind of system which he or she could depend upon for accountability. Mrs. Ferenc kept beer and alcohol in the house. She sold chips to those who wanted to be served beer or whiskey. Anyone then with a chip could purchase a beer or shot of whiskey. With a house full of boarders, Mrs. Feddens would often ask one of the men to chop some wood or do some errand for her. She would in return give the boarder a free beer or two, and the men never turned down that opportunity to save a chip or two. Luca said his brother Giulio was good for chopping for firewood for Mrs. Feddens, but Luca would in later life tease his brother and tell him, "You sure you were just chopping firewood?" Of course, Giulio would get a little red under the collar and use some choice Serbian words to his brother. Giulio and Luca loved and cared for each other to their very last day of life. They would sometimes have differing opinions, but they never stopped talking to one another. As further on in this story, we will realize how close they were. Holidays in a boarding house were joyous times for all living in the boarding house. It was not unusual for those of the Orthodox faith to celebrate the Western Christmas and New Year with fellow Roman Catholic friends and neighbors. Weddings were never one-day affairs as we knew them to be today. It was the Western Christmas one year at the Feddenses that Luca put his work in limbo because he and the others were devoting themselves to singing and enjoying one another's company and visiting the home of friends nearby. Lucky for Luca that he happened to be at the Feddens' home one day. Someone in the house spotted a man approaching the house, and they told Luca. Luca said he jumped into bed and covered himself with blankets and began to act like he had a bad cold and coughed quite strenuously. It was not unusual for the railroad to send out someone to check on an employee if he did not show up for work for a couple of days. And that time, Luca was the one that the railroad was concerned about. The man was let inside, and he told them he was looking for Luca. He was led to Luca's room. Luca believed he was the railroad doctor. He called out to Luca and asked, "How are you, Luki?" Of course, between his fake coughing, he told him, "Not too good." As Luca told this story to his children, he was laughing because had the doctor gotten close to him, the smell of his breath would have knocked him over. But the doctor simply said, "You take care of that cold, Luke, and don't come back to work until you feel you are better." Probably the doctor knew what was going on with Luca and the others, but he went along with them. Also, perhaps such a visit could encourage the men to come back to work sooner than they wanted to. And this, of course, turned out to be true in many instances. All the Feddenses were a good and kind couple to their boarders. One would probably have to have some pity on them because with a handful of boarders and all the things they had to contend with, even Luca said they had no privacy, and their life wasn't really one that anybody would really envy. Luca said the couple would leave the house together and go to the outhouse in the back to discuss privately what they didn't want the boarders to hear. Of course, Luca laughed at his words as if to say there were other motives. Mrs. Feddens hired a young Croatian girl by the name of Jana Tushkan, who had just come to America to help with chores in the house. Jana cast her eyes upon Luca and never lost sight of him. She fell in love with him. Luca, as any man, felt flattered with the knowledge she was smitten with him. Luca was still dreaming and planning to save money, enough money to go back to the homeland and reclaim his lost love, Sophie. His conversation about Sophie made one believe his love for her was eternal. As much as he longed to see and be with Sophie, Luca, deep inside, probably knew he lost his chance with the incident he had with Sophie's husband and her father. Her father placed much trust and faith in Luca, and even if the opportunity availed itself to Luca, so far as Sophie was concerned, Luca believed Malic would not be forgiving for making his son-in-law come home. As much as Luca loved Sophie, so Jana loved and longed to be with Luca as his wife. One day, Jana informed